Here on First at 3, a coalition of organizations, including public school groups, started a petition drive today to ask Nebraskans whether a new law should stay or go. Support Our Schools Nebraska gathered on the steps of the state capitol in Lincoln this morning. LB753 is known as the Opportunity Scholarships Act, or the school choice bill that the governor signed into law. It'll set aside $25 million in tax credits a year for donors to create private school scholarships to help low-income families send their student to those schools. Opponents say the bill eats into public education dollars, and it creates an uneven playing field since private schools can pick and choose their students and public schools cannot. Organizers hope to gather 90,000 signatures over the next 90 days. If that happens, the issue would be put to a vote of the people in the November 2024 election. Governor Jim Pillen spoke about the bill today, saying, quote, "As Nebraskans, we believe we should never, ever give up on a kid. This piece of legislation is part of my continuing commitment to put kids first so we can make our state a place where future generations can grow and thrive," end quote. The main sponsor of the bill, Senator Lou Ann Linehan of Elkhorn, released this statement. "We, the 33 senators who supported LB753, are deeply disappointed that some in the Nebraska public education establishment are pursuing a multi-million-dollar ballot initiative denying opportunities to vulnerable and at-risk children." Much more coverage on this story over at WOWT.com.